There is a phrase Canada uses about itself more than almost any other country uses about itself. Open, inclusive, defined not by blood or birthplace, but by shared values. It is the foundational promise of Canadian multiculturalism, enshrined in law, repeated by every prime minister since Pierre Trudeau, built into the country's identity at a level that most Canadians do not think of as a policy position. They think of it as a fact. And then, in the span of 3 weeks in June of 2026, the Canadian government did 3 things. It froze the citizenship applications of a group known as the Lost Canadians, people who were denied citizenship for decades by outdated laws and bureaucratic failures that had nothing to do with their connection to this country. It issued a directive ordering Canadians born outside Canada to surrender their citizenship certificates to the government during the course of an investigation. And it continued advancing legislation that would require every social media user in the country to verify their identity through a government-approved third-party system before they could post online. 3 moves, 3 weeks. The official explanation for each one is different. A system review, a security measure, child protection. Most coverage has treated them as 3 unrelated administrative stories happening to collide on the same calendar. They are not unrelated. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what connects them and why the pattern they form together should concern anyone who believed the foundational promise. Here is what actually happened with the Lost Canadians, because that story has a history most Canadians have never been told in full. The term Lost Canadians refers to people who, through no fault of their own, fell through the cracks of Canadian citizenship law. Some were born to Canadian parents abroad before certain legislative changes took effect. Some were children of war brides whose citizenship status was never properly transferred under the laws of the time. Some had lived their entire adult lives in Canada, paid taxes, raised children, served in the military, and only discovered late in life that a bureaucratic anomaly meant they had never been legally Canadian at all. This is not a small or theoretical group. Advocates estimate there are tens of thousands of people in this category. For years, they have been working through the legal system to have their status recognized, a process that is slow, expensive, and emotionally devastating for people who have spent their lives assuming they belonged. And then, without public announcement and without explanation, the government suspended their applications. Not denied them, suspended them. The distinction matters. A denial gives you a legal pathway to challenge the decision. A suspension leaves you in a procedural void with no timeline, no recourse, and no official reason given for why the process that was moving, however slowly, has now stopped entirely. The government's public language on this has been minimal. A review is underway. Updates will be provided. That is the official framing. The operational reality is that thousands of people who have been waiting years for the state to acknowledge that they are who they say they are have been told, in effect, to keep waiting, indefinitely, for reasons that have not been disclosed. Now, hold that against the second development, because the timing is the story. On June 13th of this year, the federal government issued a directive requiring Canadians born outside Canada, a specific subset of citizens defined by their birthplace, to surrender their citizenship certificates to the government during the course of an investigation. Not after a conviction, not after a formal finding of wrongdoing. During an investigation, which is a stage of legal process at which a person is, under Canadian law, presumed innocent. Legal experts noticed immediately. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically Section 15, guarantees equality rights. It states that every individual is equal before and under the law, and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. The directive creates a distinct legal category based on where a person was born. Canadians born in Canada are not subject to the same requirement during an investigation. Canadians born outside Canada are. That is not a technical distinction. That is a two-tier citizenship structure. And it is precisely the kind of structural inequality that Section 15 was written to prevent. The legal scholars who raised this concern were not doing so quietly. They were using the word unconstitutional in public statements, in law reviews, in interviews with national media. That is a strong word for legal professionals who are trained to be careful about their language. When multiple constitutional scholars reach the same conclusion independently and state it publicly, the government's silence on the substance of their argument is itself a data point. Ottawa has not engaged with the constitutional critique. It has repeated the security rationale. These are not the same conversation. And here is where the third development enters the picture. Because to understand what is actually happening, you need to see all three moves together. Bill C-34 and Bill C-36, currently moving through the parliamentary process, would require every user of a social media platform in Canada to verify their identity through a government-approved third-party system. The stated purpose is child protection, specifically preventing minors under 16 from accessing social platforms. But as privacy experts and civil liberties organizations have pointed out in detail, you cannot verify that a user is not a minor without verifying who the user actually is. Which means the system is not a child protection mechanism with an identity verification component. It is an identity verification system with a child protection justification. Every adult Canadian who wants to use Facebook, Reddit, or Instagram will be required to submit government-verified identification to a private company whose security record is not guaranteed before they can log in. Now step back and see the shape of all three moves together. The government froze citizenship applications for people whose connection to Canada is disputed on bureaucratic grounds. It required citizens born outside Canada to surrender physical identity documents during investigations. And it is building a system that will require all citizens to submit identity documents to a third-party infrastructure in order to participate in digital public life. The direction of all three moves is the same. The state is accumulating control over the document that answers the most fundamental question any government asks about any person. Are you one of us? That is the official framing of each individual measure. And it is the question the three measures collectively answer by expanding the circumstances under which the government can say, not yet, or not anymore, or only if you comply. The most consequential thing any government does is not levy taxes or deploy armies. It is decide who belongs. Citizenship is the mechanism through which that decision is made formal and legal. And citizenship is not a static category. It is a legal construction that governments can expand or contract, complicate or simplify, make more or less contingent on compliance with state requirements. The three moves Canada made in June of 2026 all move in the same direction. They make citizenship more contingent, more conditional, more subject to administrative review, documentary requirement, and infrastructural gatekeeping. And here is the part that makes this difficult to discuss in the terms the coverage has used so far. None of these three moves is, on its own, a dramatic act. The suspension of the Lost Canadians applications is bureaucratic. The certificate surrender directive is procedural. The digital identity legislation is framed as protective. None of them looks, in isolation, like a government rewriting the foundational promise of Canadian citizenship. But policies are not read in isolation by the people they affect. They are experienced as a pattern. And the pattern that emerges from reading these three developments together is of a government that is quietly but systematically expanding its capacity to define, document, and conditionally withdraw the status that is supposed to be the most secure thing a Canadian has. There is a tension here that the government has not acknowledged. The same administration that presents itself internationally as a champion of democratic values, of the rule of law, of the rights of middle powers against hegemonic pressure, is the administration that has suspended the applications of its own most legally vulnerable citizens without explanation, issued a directive that leading constitutional scholars call discriminatory, and advanced legislation that would put every Canadian's identity documents through a government-adjacent private system. The external posture and the internal architecture are pulling in different directions, and the gap between them is widening. Consider what this looks like from the perspective of a lost Canadian. You have spent years, perhaps decades, building a life in Canada. You have paid taxes. You may have raised children who are Canadian citizens. You have been working through a legal process to have the state formally acknowledge what you have always believed yourself to be. And then one day, with no explanation, the process stops. Not because you did anything wrong, not because new information came to light, because a review is underway. And while the review is underway, you are in a legal category that has no name and no timeline and no clear path forward. That experience of the state's capacity to withhold formal belonging is not an abstraction. It is a daily condition for tens of thousands of people. And the government's silence on the substance of why it happened is the most legible signal it has sent about whose concerns it takes seriously. The standard has changed. For decades, the dominant story Canada told about itself, to its own citizens and to the world, was of a country that believed citizenship was a right, not a privilege, and that the state's role was to extend and protect that right, not to audit and condition it. The three moves made in June of 2026 do not fit cleanly inside that story. They fit inside a different story, one in which the state is the authority that decides who is sufficiently documented, sufficiently verifiable, and sufficiently compliant to be recognized as fully belonging. That story has a name in the literature of political science and constitutional law. It is not a comfortable one. And it is worth naming carefully because the distance between the country Canada says it is and the country these policies are building is not yet so large that it cannot be closed. But it is growing. Quietly. Incrementally. One suspended application, one surrendered certificate, one verified identity at a time. Watch what happens when the constitutional challenge to the June 13th directive reaches a court. Because it will. Legal scholars do not use the word unconstitutional in public unless they believe they can prove it. And watch whether the lost Canadians receive an explanation for the suspension of their applications. Not a timeline, not a procedural update, but an actual explanation for why applications that were moving stopped. Because the absence of that explanation is itself a policy. It tells the people affected that their uncertainty is acceptable to the people making the decisions. And in a country that defines itself by the promise of open and equal belonging, that silence is the most revealing thing the government has said all month. If this story is telling you something you have not heard elsewhere, share it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear it. Like the video if you want more of this, and I will see you in the next.